Hello and welcome back to another episode of the No Lift podcast. My name is Arthur Lynch, and joining me for this episode, I have the pleasure of speaking with Ian Darragh once again. We're going to do another one of our journal deep dives. As I was saying earlier on, I haven't really settled on a catchy title for this journal paper review segment that we're doing. At one point, I thought of calling it intervention versus implementation. Intervention meaning the actual study, and then the implementation relating more so to the practitioner and how they can apply the findings of it. But then I forgot all about that the last day, so I guess we're not going to call it that. However, Ian, good morning. How are you?
I'm doing very well, Arthur. Thanks again for having me on. I'm excited to. I'm actually excited to talk about this. Muscle fiber typing is a pet topic of mine. This is actually something I'm pretty interested in. So I'm excited for this. I think implementation versus intervention it's catchy, but it's also how much of sports science is actually useful for anyone. It's a little bit apocalyptic.
We might spend a lot of time on the intervention and then get to the implementation and conclude not at all. Which is fine, I mean, that can be useful for people too. So for the benefit of the audio only listeners, the paper we're going to tackle today is titled Prediction of Muscle Fiber Composition Using Multiple Repetition Testing. And so if for whatever reason you were interested to know, what's what relative proportion of muscle fiber type 1 and type 2A and type 2X do I possess in a given muscle group, you would correctly conclude that that's a very difficult thing to find out. But this multiple repetition test, so say for example you perform a volitional set of squats to volitional fatigue at say 80% of your 1RM, and if you get a lot of reps, you could conclude that you're predominantly slow twitch. If you didn't get a lot of reps, you would surmise that you're predominantly type 2 fibers. So that's the kind of the background to this study here. Now I know you're kind of frothing at the mouth at even what I've said there's already. So take it away, Ian. Where do you want to start with this one?
Well, yeah. So I actually think that, and this is I think this study design, the idea of what this study is trying to do, is actually something that's quite commonly done in sports science. In that, and I guess when we get to speaking about some of the physiology behind this before getting into the study itself, it'll kind of make sense. But the idea of what these authors are essentially trying to do is they're trying to take an invasive physiological measure, which is the determination of the proportion of muscle fiber types, and we might explain what's kind of meant by that in a second. Which is quite an invasive laboratory-based procedures, and you have to go into a lab. A physician has to take a bit of your muscle, and then a bench scientist will have to analyze that muscle to make an estimate of your muscle fiber type. And they've tried to come up with they've tried to validate a field-based test, so something that's non-invasive. You don't have to go to a lab. There doesn't have to be a scientist or a clinician around you. A coach and an athlete can do it, and they can similarly get some indication of what the laboratory test result might have said. And that's essentially what they're trying to do here. The specific piece of kind of physiology that they're trying to get an indication of is the proportion of muscle fiber types that an individual may have. And I think probably the first thing we should do on that, and I know this is something that's probably, even in kind of the general population, I think a lot of people are aware of the idea that skeletal muscle has different fiber types. You'll hear, if you're watching, say, the Olympics in a few weeks and the 100-meter sprint is on, you might hear commentators say, he's all fast twitch, he's all quick twitch, that sort of stuff. So people, I think, are aware of the idea that there are these different types of skeletal muscle, but just for the sake of making things absolutely clear, the first thing we might want to do is just explain what is meant by muscle fiber type, and what having a predominance of a specific muscle fiber type might imply for what type of athletic events an individual might be, let's say, talented in, or have a capacity to have a high level of competence in, at least from a skeletal muscle perspective. So I don't know if you want to start
there. Yeah, so I mean, like, broadly speaking, so we have our type 1 fibers, which are slow twitch muscle fibers. They have a high oxidative capacity, lower glycolytic capacity. They have a higher proportion of intramuscular lipid. So one of the adaptations to endurance training is that you actually store more lipid, more fat in your muscle, which serves as an energy store there that can be used during exercise. On the other hand, then you have your type 2A and your type 2X. Your type 2A would be your fast twitch, fatigue resistant, and then your type 2X would be your fast twitch fatigable. And Henneman's size principle would dictate that, initially what you do when you're contracting and when the demand is low, you're going to recruit predominantly slow twitch muscle fibers. And as the demand increases, or, for example, you have to do more and more repetitions, that you tap into more of the type 2A and then the type 2X fibers. And the threshold for recruiting those is much higher than the type 2s. And broadly speaking, yeah, you sort of surmise that high-level sprinters or power athletes would have a higher proportion of type 2s, and particularly those type 2X fibers. And high-level endurance athletes would possess a greater proportion of type 1 muscle fibers. Anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think just maybe on a global conceptual level, just to say, essentially, you're completely right in some respects, in that when we look at a muscle, it's organized into these, and we'll actually see a nice picture of it in this this paper. So anyone who's listening on the audio will be at a deficit, and they'll have to listen twice and watch it on YouTube. I can actually
flick to that now if you want.
Yeah. So muscle fibers, or sorry, skeletal muscle organizes at several levels, and anyone who's done a first year physiology course will have seen there's a very stereotypical image that's used of, like, first you have a big muscle and then it zooms in and there's like bundles of fibers, and then it zooms in and it's a single fiber and then a sarcomere. But they organize into bundles, and in each bundle, again, literally think of it as like a bundle of sticks, and each stick is what's called a muscle fiber. And these muscle fibers are essentially evolved to participate in different tasks. So you have the type 1 muscle fibers, which, as you've quite correctly said, are the most fatigue resistant and the most readily recruitable. So they're used for, outside of the context of exercise, simple tasks. So if you go, I want to pick up a pen, I want to lift a cup and take a sip of my coffee, that shouldn't be a task that is particularly high force or, expensive kind of metabolically to do. And therefore we have slow twitch muscle fibers that will be involved in doing that. And they're highly fatigue resistant, they're readily recruitable. And the idea is, the reason they're more readily recruitable than fast twitch fibers, which are capable of producing, they contract faster and therefore can be used to produce more force, is for tasks where that's not required, a high stimulus isn't required, they'll be kind of left off, and that means it's not going to be for the whole organism as expensive to do simple tasks. Slow twitch fibers are also kind of predominantly made up in muscles that are kind of always contracting a little bit. So a great example is that the muscles in your back, particularly if you're a human, because we're the only true bipedal mammals. We're the only true mammals that actually stand up straight entirely. A lot of the muscles in your erectors in your back are type 1 because they have to be contracted all the time or else you just fall over, so that's just an example. Type 2 muscle fibers then are used for more explosive high force tasks, and again they've got a higher recruitment threshold. You basically need to have a higher level of intent to recruit them, but they produce more force. And then we can obviously separate sports based on the type of task that's involved. So if you look at marathon running, that's a very long duration event. If you're very elite, it's 2 hours, but for most people, it's about 4. Each step that you take is not that much of an effort in terms of the amount of force you have to produce, but you're going to have to take a lot of steps. So it's mostly a type 1 activity. If you look at an 100-meter sprint or a weightlifting exercise or powerlifting, it's a very short duration event. It's only a matter of seconds, but it's obviously maximum force, maximum recruitment, and therefore it's going to be kind of presumed to be a type 2 muscle kind of predominating sport. I guess the one thing to point out, it's something that'll maybe come up as we progress through. Type 1 fibers, there is only one type of type 1 fiber in humans. So you have type 1 muscle. But in type 2, there is kind of this separation, is in that type 2 muscle can be delineated into different types or subtypes. So you have type 2A and type 2X fibers, with type 2A generally being referred to as, in quotation marks, the intermediate fiber, and type 2X being kind of the fastest fiber. But something actually that's maybe important to comment on, and there's a really nice paper, Serrano et al. 2019. It's Andy Galpin's lab, if anyone is familiar with him. They got some muscle biopsies from 2015 Worlds and American Nationals, which were in Houston. They got biopsies of high-level Olympic weightlifters, and this is something that's actually acknowledged. But type 2X fibers are actually, even in athletes that are in strength and power sports, they're often not in a high proportion. Just for example, in that study, they had about 20 athletes, and I think the majority of them, say, for argument's sake, somewhere between 17 or 18 of them, they didn't detect any type 2X fibers. So even though humans possess them and they are the most fast twitch, they're actually in such a low abundance across a whole muscle or across all of your muscles, that even when you look at strength and power athletes, you would actually expect to see the majority fiber type to ideally actually be type 2A instead of type 2X. That's just one thing to comment on.
Yeah.
But so that's the physiology there. So when we look at this study, what they're trying to do is look at an estimate of the percentage of type 2 muscle fibers, which would be an indication of your absolute strength performance, but also your capacity for fatigue resistance, and basically determine if there's a laboratory test that can associate with that percentage based off how quickly you fatigue at a fixed percentage of 1RM.
So we'll save any discussions around, like, if we even want to know this in the first place, to later on, but we'll take it from the start. So, I mean, in the intro here, so they go through some of the information that we've just outlined around, what are the characteristics of type 1 muscle fibers and type 2A and type 2X. Incidentally, just to dovetail off the point you made, it's my understanding as well that there is, so say when you begin strength training, if you do this type of analysis pre and post a strength training intervention, that there's actually a shift in the expression from type 1 and from type 2X to a greater proportion of type 2As. That's my understanding anyway. I don't know if you know more on that.
That's that's actually correct. So that's another thing you see with athletes in particular, in that there seems to be muscle fiber types, particularly type 2 fibers, can shift between subgroups. So type 2X can kind of, I'm trying not to say transform because that's a bit magical, but can transfer their characteristics to be more like type 2A muscle fibers. The transition between type 2A and type 1, we kind of assume it has to occur, and that'll kind of come back to when we talk about cross-sectional studies of athletes. But it's harder to catch, so it's presumed to be a process that takes much longer. And similarly, the transition of type 1 to type 2A with training, what you will see in individuals who actually become sedentary, so most, like, people who are healthy but not exercising tend to be fairly split down the middle in terms of their fiber type distribution. And one of the things like bed rest and injury and stuff like that, you'll see type 1 fibers transform to type 2 or type 2A. But yeah, type 2A transition from type 2X is a common characteristic of both strength and endurance training, actually.
Cool. So from my point of view, there's nothing really here in the introduction that really needs to be fleshed out in any great detail, other than the fact that what they're proposing to do here was test a group of individuals, get their 1 rep max squat, and then perform a repetitions to failure task at 80% of their 1RM. They allude to some previous studies that used the leg press, and they use an interesting rationale for why they use the back squat. And don't get me wrong, I'm delighted that they did. I would much rather see this done in a squat than a leg press, but their argument was, access to a leg press may not always be possible. Barbells and plates are much more prevalent, and the back squat is a viable alternative for this type of test. I don't know. Like I think some ethics review boards might say that a leg press is safer, but I don't necessarily buy that. So what are your thoughts on that rationale?
I think the context there is that this is a Russian research group, so it's perhaps possible that in Russia, where everyone is extremely strong and does powerlifting and weightlifting training, that the barbell is more common than the leg press, unlike everywhere else in the West. But I actually did. I chuckled to myself about that rationale as well, where they were like, because normally you would see we use the leg press because a barbell may not be accessible or usable by everyone. And then in this study, they're like, we use the barbell because a leg press may not be accessible or usable by everyone. No, I did laugh.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll skip on to the methods. So this table 1 is the only table that appears in this study.
Yeah.
We alluded to this earlier on, that there's fuck all data presented. But anyway, we'll go through what we have. And, this is terrible, but I am a bit of a snob when it comes to these studies. So that if I see a table like this of subject characteristics, my eyes very quickly divert to this kind of value here, 1RM squat. How fucking strong were they? And it turns out they're at a decent level. I mean, given the standard deviation, I mean, you could have some guys certainly over like the 180, somewhere in the 180 to 200 range. But the average was 155. And then for the females, the average is 70.5 kilos. Any comments on the sample?
Just a few things. Sorry, one thing mainly. I think one thing we haven't pointed out was this was a parallel squat, so it was a squat to 90 degrees. Not to disparage, these are actually, at least the male participants are a lot stronger than you tend to see in most kind of studies of this nature, which is nice. But it is a parallel squat. It's not an ATG beautiful, whatever squat. But he's similar to you. Something I would like, it's becoming more common, which is nice. They haven't done it here, is something like a figure or a distribution where you can actually see what each individual participant's value was. It would have been nice to see that, because while they have an average of 155 here, averages are sensitive to outliers. So say every guy was doing 140 and then one lad did 220, that could shoot the average up a lot. So it would just be nice to see approximately what each participant did. But no, apart from that, it's pretty run-of-the-mill stuff here.
Yeah. It's a pretty good size as well. So you've got 10 female participants and 20 male participants, which is pretty decent. So then some of the characteristics, average age for the females, 26, average age for the males, 32. They were fairly well trained in terms of how long they reported involvement in systematic training. Now, so like some of them were, where was it? Oh, some of them were
I
like
think
they
the
were
average
training
was
over a
about 10
decade.
years.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
sorry, it's
yeah,
probably in the
yeah,
table.
It actually isn't. Oh no,
Training
this there.
training
So yeah,
experience. Yeah,
yeah.
10 or 11 years. So I mean, again, I know I'm going to sound like a complete snob here, but if I was training that long and that was my max squat, I mean, okay, fair enough. Maybe you're not going in deliberately to improve your 1RM squat, but I would have thought that after, like, I don't know, 7, 8 years, you might be like, you know what, maybe I'll put a little bit more weight in the bar, see if I can do it. I don't know. So
I mean, it is a criticism of the study, but now to be fair, like this is something you see a lot in that they don't really explain particularly well how they define years of training to a participant. So
right,
like, how long have you been training? It's like, oh, well, I played football from 11 to 16, and then I've been in the gym for 2 years, and there isn't that level of detail. And again, it would be nice to see that tabulated. And sometimes in other studies, you will see examples of the questions participants were asked as well, the exact question. Now, I think it's the nature of that this data is a little bit more physiological. So I presume the reviewers are more concerned with the physiological data, and then these kind of issues just get looked over and like, oh, that was
yeah.
fine. They trained for 10 years. Okay, cool. But no, I agree with you. It would be nice to, it would have been nice to get a more detailed idea of what the participants actually did in terms of training.
Yeah. So then in terms of the procedures, as we've already mentioned, worked up to a 1RM, then gave them a 15-minute rest, and then performed the 80% of 1RM test to failure. So just to see how many repetitions they could perform, and then using that to indicate their muscle fiber composition.
It might be worth talking about how they actually estimated the percentage of fast twitch and slow twitch fibers. If you just scroll back up a little bit to the image here, because there's a couple of ways you can do this. So the technique they've used, and it's not an invalid technique. It's one of the more accepted ones. There's basically 3 ways you can estimate the proportion of muscle fibers in a sample using from a muscle biopsy. And what they've used is what's called the cross-sectional technique. And essentially what they've done is they've looked at a muscle cross section. So the way to think about this, and for people who are viewing on YouTube, you can see an image here, and in the image there's kind of like these green circles which are interspersed by black gaps, and each of these green circles which are outlined here represents a single muscle fiber. So when you do a muscle fiber cross section, you take a muscle biopsy sample, and if you imagine a muscle as being like a tree that's stuck in the ground, to look at it from a cross-sectional perspective is to cut the tree down, stand on top of it, and look at the individual rings, like if you saw a tree stump. And what they do is they conjugate antibodies to this muscle cross-section, and the antibodies will stain for proteins that are exclusively present in either type 1 or type 2 muscle fibers. And then they conjugate a second antibody, which will make it fluoresce, and that's where you get this green, these green images here. And essentially it's a semi-quantitative technique in that so you can see it's green in both slides, which means they've estimated the fast twitch and the slow twitch muscle fibers from 2 different samples or 2 different processes of the same sample. So what that means is you go, okay, I count this, I estimate there's 10 total fibers on my screen here, 8 of them have stained positive, you're 80% fast twitch muscle fiber. And then you do the same with slow twitch. And that's actually why if you look at some of the participants, their proportion of fast twitch and slow twitch adds up to more than 100%, that's because they're from two separate samples. So it was just in sample 1, 51% might have been fast twitch, and in sample 2, 51% might have also been slow twitch, which makes 102%, but it's two different samples. That's why that went that way. So it's a semi-quantitative technique. And also the other thing to comment on before we move on is it's inferential in the sense that you take a very small muscle biopsy, you estimate the proportion of whatever fast twitch or slow twitch muscle fibers in that biopsy, and then you presume that's continuous across the whole muscle. But you're taking a 10 milligram muscle biopsy sample and presuming for a several kilogram in weight muscle that it's that's the proportion. But that's the method they've used to estimate it, and it is a commonly used and accepted technique.
Yeah, and my apologies. I think I failed to mention thus far that they actually did take a biopsy here as well as the repetitions to fatigue test. So it's not like they just did the 80% of 1RM test and said, okay, there's your muscle fiber type composition based off that. They've actually compared it with the biopsy to see, well, how does this stack up? Okay, so on to the results then. So we kind of have to skip back to our very detailed table to see the number of completed repetitions at 80% of 1RM. So it's difficult to actually glean a lot from that because it doesn't vary a whole pile. You know what I mean?
No, yeah. So, well, at least on average, the males and females had a similar distribution of fast twitch and slow twitch muscle fibers, in that they were approximately 50-50 on each case. Obviously, for the females, they have on average 56% slow twitch fibers, which is kind of an anecdote which is given about females, and that's simply because circulating testosterone promotes type 2A muscle fiber transition. So it is assumed that men have a higher abundance of type 2 muscle fibers, but they're approximately the same, roughly speaking. And then they've also approximately done, it's 9.8 versus 10.3 repetitions at 80%. So on average, the groups were pretty much identical in their fiber composition and their reps to failure. I think where the data that these researchers are hoping to present as important comes out is in the figure, the correlation figure, which is just actually quite small. Again, there isn't a massive amount of data presented in this study here. And this is essentially, so what you've got in this figure is you've got black squares representing the males and hollow circles representing the females. And you've got the percentage of type 2 muscle fibers or fast twitch muscle fibers, you've got the number of repetitions that the individual performed at 80% plotted against the percentage of fast twitch muscle fibers. And essentially what they've tried to do here is look for a relationship. And if there was a really, really strong relationship in this graph, what you would do is you see this black line, this line of best fit, which kind of runs across from the left-hand side to the right-hand side of the graph. If there was a very strong relationship here between the percentage of fast twitch muscle fibers and the number of repetitions each individual would perform, all of the points on this graph would congregate very, very close to this line. As you can see, it's more of a shotgun blast. There's quite a dispersed distribution. And while the kind of researchers of this paper argue that there is kind of a reasonably strong relationship here, I think looking at this figure, it would be difficult to agree with them. I'm not sure what you would say in response to that.
Well, I think the correlation coefficient was it was like 0.36 or something like that. So like I wouldn't want to be laying any bets on it, I'll put it that way. And even if we look, like if we really dig in here, we'll see, this subject here got approximately 10 reps, but they're apparently up around 80% fast twitch. This person got like 5
I
five
think that,
reps, and they're about what, like 65%. Okay, that makes sense. This one here,
I
up around 65 as well, but they got like 14 reps.
yeah, I think something that really stuck out to me on this figure is that, and you actually just alluded to it a second ago, the individual with the highest amount of fast twitch muscle fibers and the individual with the lowest amount of fast twitch muscle fibers, or in other words, the highest amount of type 1 muscle fibers, are reported as performing exactly the same number of repetitions at 80%.
Yeah.
So that
This,
kind of that throws any relationship out the window pretty quickly.
yeah. But you know what? Like, there's actually, if you took those four, they're on that line there. If you took those four and averaged them, it would fit in perfectly.
Yeah. So, and this is the danger of correlation techniques. So, just for the listeners, you alluded to a correlation coefficient of 0.36. Just for people who might not be familiar, correlations run on a line of 0 to 1, with 1 being a perfect relationship, absolutely strong, and 0 being definitely no relationship. So 0.3 is, there are sometimes thresholds that researchers will use, and 0.4 will be considered like a, in quotation marks, moderate correlation. I wouldn't look too much into those, because it really should be about how the data looks. And here is an example of having close to a kind of, by some people's definition, moderate correlation in terms of its strength. But when you actually look at how the data distribute, there's no real relationship. And it's important to note that things like what you've pointed out there do affect. Correlation coefficients are very sensitive to how those points organize. So the fact that those 4 points, where you've got 2 individuals with a high number of fast twitch muscle fibers and 2 individuals with a low number of fast twitch muscle fibers performing exactly the same number of repetitions, that will have a very strong influence on that correlation coefficient. And sometimes it can create some skullduggery where the line can be manipulated. For example, you have 2 participants on the right hand side of the plot who have a fairly low number of fast twitch muscle fibers. They're both probably 50% or lower, and have performed a very high number of repetitions. And then if you have one participant on the other side, which you do, who has about 70% fast twitch muscle fibers and performed only about 5 repetitions, those 3 points will very much influence the slope of that line by a lot, because the way this line is developed statistically, it's accounting for all the points, and it's trying to find the position where it will have the closest distance to every point it possibly can. So it's very sensitive to data distributing like that. So you have to be careful when you're analyzing just on numbers alone.
Cool. Right, so we'll zoom out from there. And yeah. Now, there was one part of the discussion that I wanted to touch on, and that's basically, like, I've no issues with the actual study itself, how they went about things. My concern, so, it's twofold. The first one is around, the practical applicability of this, but, and I'll get to that in a moment, but more so like the premise of the test itself. So they've used, so this reference here, number 35, so that's Karp 2001, and I'm just going to quickly jump over to that. And so it's this 2001 paper by Jason Karp. Now, look, the fact that it's 20 years old, I mean, if you were to bring this up with this individual again, I mean, I've never come across them before, but perhaps they've changed their thoughts on this in the intervening decades. But, I just highlighted one section here, which is related to the test itself. So, I mean, so they mention about how if you wanted to know your muscle fiber composition, it's quite invasive and expensive. And you might want a field-based measure that's, more accessible for people. So he's proposing the 80% of 1RM test. If the client can only perform 7 repetitions, then the muscle group is likely composed of more than 50% fast twitch fibers. If they can perform more than 12 reps, then the muscle group likely has more than 50% of slow twitch fibers. And if they're between 7 and 12, then the muscle group probably has an equal proportion of slow and fast twitch fibers. And then the next bit just kills me. Although this method has not been proven scientifically, it offers a way for the fitness professional to assess the capabilities of his or her client's muscles. So, I don't know, man. I don't want to seem like a dickhead, but that doesn't really fill me with a lot of confidence.
Well, there's a couple of things to unpack there, because there's a few things in that statement that are worth commenting on. The first one is, like, as a personal trainer in a gym, under no circumstances do you need to know the muscle fiber composition of your clients. Some people, I think I can imagine someone of the two people who are now listening to me talk, I can imagine that one of them has gone, well, what about athletes? Well, the funny thing about athletes is, if you go, well, I work with a sprinter, it's important for me to know if they have a type 2A or a fast twitch, muscle. They're predominantly fast twitch muscle. They're a world-class sprinter. It's very important that I know that. And you go, you already know it if they're a world-class sprinter. Events will select for characteristics. That's one thing to say if they're an athlete. The other thing is, if you have someone who is not a world-class sprinter, but they love training sprinting, I wouldn't disparage that person if you get some kind of lab-based estimate that goes, oh, you're a mostly slow twitch. Sorry, you're never going to win the Olympics. They're like, oh, but I really enjoy this training anyway. The other thing is more of a physiological point, where if you note in that statement that you just read out, the important term there is muscle groups, because the statement that if you go, oh, I can't remember the exact number of repetitions. I think it was, if it was 8 to 10, they had approximately 50% fast twitch and slow twitch muscle fibers. Muscle fiber composition will vary between individual muscles, because individual muscles have evolved to serve different individual purposes. And we actually leverage that in physiology quite often. So you'll see in some studies, when there are comparisons that are made, usually in rodent studies, so in studies concerned with mice or rats, where the organism is so small, you can't really isolate individual muscle fibers. Instead, you extract whole muscles. So you'll take an entire muscle off a bone and do a comparison between two whole muscles instead of a sample from an individual muscle. The muscles will be selected when they're trying to do studies on fiber composition. The muscles will be selected based off whether that muscle has a tendency to be mostly fast twitch or mostly slow twitch. So an example there is the soleus muscle, which even in humans as well is predominantly slow twitch. So even in someone who is fast twitch, they may have 80% slow twitch muscle fibers in their soleus muscle, even if they're Usain Bolt, and the difference between Usain Bolt and Mo Farah is Mo Farah has 98% type 1 muscle fibers in his soleus. So the problem with that statement is, you go across muscle groups. So look at the back squat. How many muscles are involved in the back squat? You can't presume based off one test that this individual is like bang down the middle, 50-50 type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers across all of the muscles involved in the back squat. I've already talked about, for example, spinal erector muscles, which are in most people, or in all people, going to be mostly type 1 muscle fibers, because they have to be, so they're also a muscle that are heavily involved in the back squat. They're how you maintain your posture. If you're doing a low bar back squat, they're actually actively involved in lifting the bar. So that's kind of one example of how you can't really use that test to make an inference on a multi-muscle level. It still may have some utility as an intellectual exercise, and particularly maybe for researchers in individual muscle, like, as a weak estimate, but you won't be able to use it as an estimate across muscle groups in multi-joint exercises like a squat, for that reason alone.
Yeah, and to touch on a point that you made there a few moments ago, the other kind of concern I have around this study, I mean, I don't think it's something that like would concern the researchers all that much, nor should it. But someone picks up this information and they take it at face value, and then they go and do this test. You know, they do the 80% of 1RM to failure, and let's say they get like 14 reps. Instead of interpreting it as like, oh, cool, I got 14 reps in that. That was a really tough challenge, and I overcame it, and you know, I feel good about myself. You could nocebo yourself into thinking, oh, fuck, I'm predominantly slow twitch fibers. I'm never going to be a high level strength athlete. Do you know what I mean? So like, I think, and the other thing as well is like, what do you do with this information on a making training decisions level? Do you know what I mean? Like if you're predominantly slow twitch fibers, does that mean you should go and do like sets of 20? I don't know. I don't think you can make that kind of decision based on this type of data, you know?
Yeah, like I'm of two minds, because this to me is intellectually interesting. Look, as in what they've attempted to do here. Now I think the data that they've presented is it's not very good. That's to be blunt, but just maybe to play devil's advocate on your point. So you could maybe argue that, and I actually agree with you, just for transparency, but you could maybe argue that perhaps, you know, you go, oh, I have this person who's a power lifter. I have this estimate that they're, in quotation marks, mostly type 1 muscle fiber dominant. It could be something where it's like, oh, it's okay for him to do, I'm going to program a workout where he does 3x3 at 90%, and I know he can do it, or I know he can recover from it. Whereas I have this other client that I'm working with, and I've estimated them as mostly type 2 muscle fibers. And if I give them 3x3 at 90%, they're not going to be able to do it to begin with. And they also might die, you know, that kind of, possibly it could be useful as a mechanism for discriminating between athletes you work with. But even then, I'm concerned about, and it's a weird thing, it's the psychology of it that concerns me, because you don't want to give your athletes some kind of a complex where, if you're working with people, I figure like you could figure that out kind of intuitively, you know, just based on working with the athlete, and you don't need to link it to some kind of loose physiology that may not even be correct for that individual, particularly based off data like this, which is not fantastic, or using data like this as a justification. Instead, it's just a case of knowing your athletes. But if you tell them off this test, oh, you're mostly slow twitch, that may really affect that person, because they may go, I want to be a strength athlete, and because I want to be a strength athlete, I think I must have to be super, super fast twitch, and you've just told me that I'm not. That, you know, that could potentially upset someone. Whereas there's, you know, I guess the point I'm trying to make is, you don't actually know that, even if you've done this test, and you don't really need to know that to adjust that individual's training in a way where you might even assume that, even in a situation where you might assume that is the case.
Yeah. I know you prefaced that by saying I'm just going to play devil's advocate here, but I think you pretty much just agreed with what I said.
Oh, no. Yeah, that's yeah. I'm not good at being a contrarian. That's
no, and that's it. And I mean, if it was a case of like, you know, you've two lifters and one of them just tends to do better, like they perform better when they do more high repetition work, they pick up fewer injuries, they perform better on meet day, versus someone else who does better with low reps and they're pretty robust and they don't break down easily and stuff like that. I mean, if you're basing your training decisions on something like that, yeah, fair game. But not like, you know, from this test that's a proxy of a proxy measure of their muscle fiber types in one muscle that might not be representative of all the prime movers and synergists in the movement we're talking about. I think that's a bad way of basing training decisions on. Even though, like yourself, I find this actually very interesting, just on an intellectual level.
Yeah, to me, I think it's something I do see, and we live in a very intellectualized era where you you are, maybe even in fitness, under pressure almost to give a scientific rationale for everything that you do. And so I think the concern is, like, sometimes people might feel the need to give, like, pseudoscientific is a bit strong, but like weak science, like scientific ration or physiological rationale for which the evidence is perhaps potentially weak. But they try to superimpose that upon a practical problem or a practical issue as a means of justifying a practical solution to a practical issue. Whereas, like, if you go, I have a problem where I have this athlete who he can only do 3 reps at 80%, you know, but he's pretty strong. He's got a 240 back squat or something like that. So I just don't give him more than 3 reps at 80%. And like, it's tempting to go, oh, here's this big physiology thing. And you go, well, no, you've just given me the problem and you've given me a solution, and you don't have to explain to me, or you don't have to try and find some science to explain it to me if it's working. You know, it is, you know, a practice, like, and I know that's probably sounds a bit strange for me to say as someone who identifies as a physiologist, but at the end of the day, in the realm of action is all that matters, you know. So while these things are interesting and they're great, you know, if you are doing something that works and you don't have a physiological explanation for it, that doesn't matter up until a point, because it works.
Yeah. And it's, so that's fine to use as a rationale. Like, you don't have to, as you say, you don't have to superimpose some pseudoscientific reasoning for your training decisions. If it's a case of, like, this is what we have found to be effective, they pick up fewer injuries when they train like this, they enjoy training like this, that's fine. You know, I don't see a problem with that.
Yeah, and I mean, there's one kind of other thing, like, because I feel like we've really tore into this study now, and I think the one thing I would say is this is useful as an experiment of seeing, do these estimates translate well into practice, and here I think it's shown that it doesn't, and we should be hesitant in saying that means, because, you know, again, it's easy to have these knee-jerk reactions where you go, oh, okay, so that means that the fiber type composition of an individual doesn't matter for their resistance training performance. That's probably not the case. It probably does contribute to an individual's potential for resistance training performance. However, the issue is it's a component of a system, and there are other elements to the system, like, you know, again, fiber type composition across muscle groups, like we talked about already. But there's also things like the muscle you have is not, like, if you go, oh, this individual is all fast twitch muscle fibers, if they're untrained and have a low capacity to recruit those muscle fibers, they may see a performance that you would not expect based off the muscle biopsy estimate. So there's other factors involved there, like simple skill with the exercise, you know, training history, etc. So there are other things in there, and I think that would be the takeaway that I get from this study. It's not to say that estimating muscle fiber type will not be, you know, it's unnecessary in almost any practical situation I can think of, but that's not to say it's still not informative. But it's not totally informative, and it's not informative as an isolated measure in a way that will tell you enough to make a large practical decision about an individual's training.
Yeah. I think ultimately it's not that this thing doesn't matter, it's just that we can't measure it very well.
We can't measure it very well, and even if you could measure it, well, like, I mean, we can measure it very well in a sample, but yeah, we just can't use that. Like, that information in a sample is difficult to translate to the totality of an individual's muscle. You know,
that's what I mean.
Yeah. But it's also only a component in a system that will contribute to the performance, and the performance in this circumstance is repetitions to failure. So it's not the only factor that will contribute to that performance. And I guess what this study says to me is, as an individual factor, it doesn't contribute enough to provide actionable information. So, you know, the other factors need to be accounted for here. They need to be identified as well, you know. And there are some I can think of, like I said, like technique and stuff like that as well. But as a standalone factor, it doesn't give you enough of the whole picture to tell you or to influence training prescription and performance, I would say.
I just happened to be, I was just scrolling around there. I was trying to find that R value, and I remembered it was in the abstract. So it was 0.38. So just shy of your moderate correlation cut off.
Yeah. But I mean, I wouldn't Jesus, I don't want people to be assumed that I stand by those thresholds, because I actually disagree with them quite a lot. But it's just something that people use, you know. So there are some disappointed scientists out there with their 0.38 correlation coefficient. But that is something that's used.
Very well. Okay, so I think we have gone through this at length now, and I think we've done a pretty good job of outlining the lack of practical takeaways for people. So do you have any kind of closing thoughts on this study, or the whole concept of muscle fiber composition, to kind of leave listeners just before we say our goodbyes?
No, I just think I would emphasize that muscle fiber type composition of an individual will be associated with their athletic performance. That's shown in studies that look at, like, and again, I would really encourage, it's an open access paper as well. It's in PLOS One. It's Serrano et al. 2019, and the title is something like an incredible proportion of type 2 muscle fibers observed in elite Olympic weightlifters. The title is something to that effect. But that's what's called a cross-sectional study. So that's where you have taken athletes, you've taken athletes, let's say, out of the zoo, so to speak, you know, that they were living in, and you've taken a measure, but you have no idea about how, and you've taken a measure of their muscle, you've looked at it, and you've measured their proportion of muscle fiber, or percentage muscle fiber type for each muscle fiber type. And you've gone, oh, wow, they're highly type 2. But you don't know, if you can't make any inference about whether that's a natural endowment, as in whether those people were born that way and that's why they happen to be good Olympic weightlifters, or if that's a training induced change. And likely it's an interaction between the two. But the takeaway point I want to make is that muscle fiber type will influence athletic performance, and it can be a characteristic that can be used to discriminate between athletes who participate in very different events. But it's not it's not necessarily the only factor that's going to influence an individual's performance. But in this study, I think we've kind of hammered down on that a lot and said, like, this doesn't mean anything. It does mean something. It's just, in the case of what these authors are trying to do in terms of an actionable concept, it's not going to work.
Excellent. All right. I think that's all that needs to be said on this one. Ian, it's been a pleasure once again chatting to you and discussing this topic at length. Thank you once again for giving up your time to chat to me, and hopefully we'll talk again soon.
The pleasure's all mine. Thank you.